Yeah, with the little arrow, yeah, you put present, right? And then you have the first option, or I don't know what the order that appears to you, but the full screen, entire screen, share an entire screen works better.
Present your entire screen. Okay, so I'm going to put, let's see if it looks, let me see now. Okay.
Maria, vamos esperar um pouquinho. Você me perguntou, né? Se a gente começa. Só uns minutinhos para ver se a gente chega mais gente, tá? Depois a gente começa a fazer o screening lá. Ela tá testando aqui, né?
Okay. Is it showing?
No.
No. Okay. So what am I doing wrong? How do I share my screen? Present.
Are you clicking on share now, right?
Can you see my
screen
now? Okay.
Then it shows this a little bit scary thing, but everything that you can see, we see as well. So if you see your screen as a PowerPoint, then we see it as well.
No, it's fine. We can see your light.
Okay.
It's fine.
Good, good. Now I'm going to plug this so I don't run out of power. So I don't see you, but I can hear you.
Yeah, that's the pity about the system, right? That when we present, we can only see the screen. And
okay. But I know you are there. I know you are there.
Maria, você tá aí? Maria Guzmão? Maria. Tá legal. Então, acho que dá pra gente começar, né? Ela vai lá. Você me avisa quando você já estiver rodando lá. Tá ao vivo já. Então, vou passar a palavra para Miguel, que vai ser nosso mediador.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Miguel Oliveira. I'd like to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me to moderate this conference tonight. It is a pleasure to introduce Marta Ortega Libaria, who is currently an associate professor at the Linguistics Department at the University of Pittsburgh. Marta is a phonetician working in prosody. She's particularly interested in how prosody shapes speech perception and the mental representation of words and sentences. The title of her conference today is Stress and Rhythm in Adult L2 Speech, Stress and Rhythm. Please join me and welcome Marta Ortega Libaria.
Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Miguel, for this kind introduction. I'm very happy to share this conference with you. And I'm going to talk today about adult prosody in second language. I'm going to talk about the stress and rhythm. Let's start. So I'm going to start by defining prosody. So prosody are the changes of pitch, duration, and intensity perceived as the language melody, which convey a vast array of meanings, from lexical to pragmatic and non-linguistic. With this huge array of meanings, prosody is the central topic of many research areas, and each of these areas can be studied from an L1 and L2 perspective. For example, from the areas on the left, we want to study research on speech styles, for example, charismatic speech. We can ask questions like, how are pitch, duration, and intensity used in charismatic speech? Are the cues that signal charismatic speech the same across languages? If pitch has a lexical function in Mandarin, tone, right, and it doesn't exist in English, does this typological difference constrain the use of pitch in charismatic speech? If charismatic speech has different cues in different languages, can adult L2 learners acquire charismatic speech in a second language. With all these different questions, we appreciate how broad the field of second language prosody is. So we cannot talk about everything. Today we will talk about L2 stress and L2 rhythm. And we will start with a brief introduction about prosody. So this introduction will present the main problem of prosody and L2 prosody in particular, and the tools of prosodic grammars that we use to address this problem. So the main problem is what we define as a mapping problem. We have a few forms to express many, many meanings. We have a complex form meaning mapping in prosody. And these few forms map to many meanings, and we have examples, for example, from behavioral research. Brown and colleagues showed that the same non-words with an ascending pitch counter were interpreted as tone 2 by Mandarin speakers and as yes-no questions by Dutch speakers. And the same forms, the same non-forms, were processed in different brain areas in several neuroscience works. So we have evidence for this ambiguity. Ambiguity is pervasive in prosody. This ambiguity that comes from these few meanings, a few forms to many meanings, let's observe this with a little bit more of detail. So what are the forms of pitch, duration, and intensity? Why do we say that we have a few forms? So let's start thinking of gestures first. So when we are talking, when we are producing a speech, in the oral cavity, we are forming what we say segments, consonants and vowels. And in the larynx, we are producing the melody. The melody is produced, correlates with vocal fold vibration. The faster we vibrate vocal folds, the higher the pitch, and the lower the lower pitch correlates with a slower vibration of vocal folds. So both things happen at the same time. They are independent from each other and happen at the same time. So in the speech signal here, when we are looking at a segment, we see that every segment has suprasegmental information. They are synchronized in time. What makes this pitch, duration, and intensity, the forms, simple, that there are only a few, is the way that we perceive these forms. When we are perceiving consonants and vowels, and we are perceiving the suprasegmental features of consonants and vowels, we perceive them in relative terms. The perception of pitch, duration, and intensity is not absolute, is in relative terms. What does it mean? That, for example, in the word apple, the first vowel is longer, louder, and has a pitch accent. And we know this in relation to the second vowel. Because of this, we have that pitch can be high and low, duration can be long and short, and intensity loud and soft. And this is what simplifies somehow the forms of suprasegmental dimensions. So with these few forms, we want to express meanings, and we associate suprasegmentals to many meanings at different levels. For example, at lexical level, we can make word minimal pairs with tone in Mandarin, right? With the stress in Spanish, hablo, habló, with pitch accents in Tokyo Japanese. We also can express syntactic meanings with pause location. Pause is not that we stop when we talk, is that we are saying, so, for example, Anna frightened the woman with the gun. Anna frightened the woman with the gun. I'm not stopping there, but we are perceiving a pause because we are elongating segments and we are doing things with suprasegmentals. And depending on where we perceive this pause, we can say that the NP is attached to different parts of the sentence, giving different meanings. Anna held the gun, or the woman held the gun. The same, we can modify the scope of this. For example, this color is dangerous to younger dogs and cats, and this color is dangerous to younger dogs and cats. We can also use speech accent location. For example, German teachers is different from German teachers. And we can express semantic meanings, pragmatic meanings like evidentiality, reference resolution, focus, turn taking, given a new information. And in addition to all these linguistic meanings at different levels, we can also express emotion. You see that at the bottom I always put a reference that can be useful to explore these topics. So now that we see that this ambiguity is pervasive, what do we do to address ambiguity in prosody? We use prosodic grammars. And here I'm going to explain briefly some tools of these prosodic grammars that are going to be useful to present stress and rhythm. So one of the tools is alignment. Alignment is how the peaks and valleys, the high and low tones synchronize with vowels, the tone-bearing units. In Mandarin Chinese, all vowels are tone-bearing units because each vowel has a tone. In English or in Brazilian Portuguese, the pitch movements are related only to stressed vowels. So stressed vowels are the tone-bearing units. Here you observe that there is an ascending pitch and a descending pitch. So we have a low-high and a high-low. And the way that this ascending trajectory synchronizes with the tone-bearing unit gives different ways of transcribing it. Here, this ascending trajectory, the peak ends within the tone-bearing unit. So we have an LH star. So the star goes to the end. And here we have the L star H. We have again an ascending trajectory, but the H is in the other, in the next segment, is not in the tone-bearing unit. So the star indicates that. The second tool that we are using and that we are going to make reference is the prosodic hierarchy. These movements, these pitch movements attached to segments, attached to vowels. So here we have a melody of a sentence attached to the segments. Com més serem, més riurem. This is a Catalan sentence that it means the more we are, the more fun is going to be. And what is important is that this attachment between melodies, between highs and lows and segments takes place at different levels, in different domains. For example, they can be attached at the word level or above the word level to intonational phrases, to utterances. We will see that, for example, this tone here represents the right edge of this intonational phrase. And we see that this movement here is attached to the last stressed syllable of the sentence, etc. Right? So different units attached to different tones attached to the vowels at different domains. And the other thing that is important is the concept of prominence. The concept of prominence is cross-linguistic. Some languages have prominence at the word level, but the way the phonetic makeup used to express prominence is language specific. So, for example, many languages have stress or have a syllable that is more important than other syllables in the word, or languages have one word that is more important than other words in a sentence, and they use prosody to highlight that. They use supersegmental cues. Here we have the cognate America, produced by an American English speaker to the left and a Japanese speaker of Tokyo to the right. Here we see that the important syllable is me, it's longer, and it has a pitch accent that has a high star, no? It's a peak here. Here we see the important syllable is me, which has a pitch accent, but the way that we signal this prominence of the pitch accent in Tokyo Japanese is by this ascending trajectory here. Here it's flat, and here we started. This is how how prominence is marked. So now that we have information about these prosodic tools and these that we use in grammars, let's go into L2 stress and let's see how these tools are going to be useful to explain L2 stress. So one thing is that when we are building word prominence, we can use the stress, like in Brazilian Portuguese, in Catalan, in English. We can make word minimal pairs based on stress. In English would be object, object. We can also build word minimal pairs with tones like in Mandarin Chinese, or we can also build word minimal pairs with pitch accents, like in Tokyo Japanese, you have a word with a pitch accent and the same segmental word without a pitch accent. Usually, these prominences are being attached at the word level. But not all languages have prominences that are expressed with pitch movements at the word level. Languages that have prominences at the word level and they are expressed with pitch movement, they are called head languages, like English, Brazilian Portuguese, Spanish, Catalan. These languages, they also have pitch movements that are attached at other levels of the prosodic hierarchy. Those are head languages. These head languages have word minimal pairs that use suprasegmental cues, like stress or tone. But there are other languages called edge languages, like standard French, like, for example, accentless dialects of Japanese, where they don't have any pitch movements linked to the word level. All the pitch movements link to levels that are above the word. So if there is any pitch movement, is to signal these domains here that are larger than the word. Of course, these languages cannot have word minimal pairs that use suprasegmental cues to contrast this word minimal pair. So now that we know all these tools and we have this introduction, let's examine a little bit the history of L2 stress. So the initial research was to answer the question, are adult speakers able to perceive L2 stress? And this question comes from our biases and perspectives, and when we have our assumptions when we study second languages. We have one of the assumptions is that the ideal speaker is the native speaker, and then when we are learning a second language, we are always comparing ourselves to the native speaker, who is the model, right? So this is why we have these questions. Are adult speakers able to perceive stress in a second language? This question initially was addressed by two teams. We are going to call the Q weight approach and the Cutler's team from the Netherlands, and then we have the other team would be like the representation approach by Dupos teams in France, in Paris. These two teams they address the same question, but they compare two very different languages. They use different methodologies, and they obtain very different evidence. And then from this different evidence, they try to build a theory. So let's examine all these differences. Languages. Cutler's theme. Native Dutch speakers learning English as second language. As we know, those are two head languages. They both have stress, and they have word minimal pairs that contrast with the stress. And the tasks that are being used to test the perception in a second language is sentences in English that have words like music and museum, that music has a stress in the first syllable, and museum doesn't have a stress in the first syllable. So the syllable mu in music and museum can be stressed or unstressed and keeps the same segmental makeup. They embedded these words into sentences and chopped the last syllable. Something like, I like mu. And then speakers have to say if this mu belongs to music or museum. When they give this task to Dutch speakers of English, it happens something that was extraordinary from this perspective, of the native speaker as the model. And the surprise was that Dutch speakers outperformed English speakers in doing this task. And then we have this second team. The second team has a different approach, which is called the representation approach. Here, they were studying French speakers of Spanish. Remember that French is an edge language, doesn't have word minimal pairs that contrast in word prominence, in something that uses suprasegmental cues to build, stress or tone or pitch accents. And Spanish is a language with a stress. And what happens is that they were giving sequence recall tasks to French speakers and Spanish speakers. The sequence recall tasks involve word minimal pairs that contrast either in a segment or in a stress. For example, like tupi, tuki is a word minimal pair that contrasts in a segment, and participants have to memorize sequences of these words like tupi, tupi, tuki, tupi, tupi, and they have to repeat them. And they do the same with word minimal pairs that contrast in stress, like numi, numi. So they hear something like numi, 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 and they have to memorize these sequences. What happened? That French speakers do very well with segments, but they do very badly with stress. And Spanish speakers do equally well with both, with segments and with stress. And it didn't matter how proficient the French speakers were, how proficient they were in Spanish. They had this persistent stress deafness. So we see that for this initial question, we have two different approaches and we get two different results. And we are trying to build a theory based on this evidence. So Cutler's theme explains this outstanding performance of Dutch speakers of English as a case of L1 to L2 Q transfer and Q weight adjustment. How does it work? How does this explanation work? In English, all unstressed vowels are schwas. In Dutch, this correlation is not as reliable, which makes Dutch speakers rely more heavily than English speakers on suprasegmental cues to stress. In the context that they examine, like mu in music or museum, there are no vowel reduction cues to stress. There are only suprasegmental cues. Dutch speakers transferred the L1 suprasegmental cues to perceive stress in English words. As a result, they outperform native speakers in this particular context because of this cue transfer. What happened with this representation approach? We saw that in this sequence recall task, French speakers, they do very well with phonemes, very bad with the stress. Doesn't matter how proficient they do, how proficient they are with the Spanish. They are beginners, intermediate, and advanced. There is always this difference. However, Spanish speakers do very well with both. They even do better here with the stress. But they did give another task to French speakers of the Spanish and Spanish speakers. This is a discrimination task. They were comparing numi and numi, or numi, numi, or numi, numi, and the same with the segmental or the phoneme contrast. And in this task, French and Spanish speakers did equally well. They could distinguish, they could say if two words were same or different based on a suprasegmental different or based on a difference of a consonant. So it's not that French speakers do not hear suprasegmental cues when they are listening to words. They do hear these suprasegmental cues, but they have this phonetic perception of these suprasegmental cues. What they don't have is a representation of a stress or a word contrast where that they can link these variations of suprasegmentals to this representation. So the way that they explain this persistent stress deafness of French speakers is that French speakers do not represent stress in their lexicon, and therefore their lack of representation at the lexical level is what causes their stress deafness. And here is the name, the representation approach. But recent research is extending all these results. This is just the beginning of the studying of L2 stress perception in L2 stress perception. So one of the things that researchers started doing was to start comparing other L1, L2 pairs. And this comparison was very fruitful because we could see that it was possible to extend this Q weight approach to pitch accents and to tone. Let me explain you one of these experiments briefly. Here we have Kim and Tremblay that they are comparing two Korean dialects. In this Korean dialect, They have pitch accents at the word level, like Japanese. They can do word minimal pairs. And they also have boundary tones, the pitch accents that are not, that they are linked at other domains that are higher than the word. So this is what we call a head language, like Brazilian Portuguese, like English, like Spanish. Seoul Korean is an edge language, like French. They don't have pitch movements that link to word contrast, only to domains that are above the word. What happened that when they are hearing pitch accent contrast, people from this dialect, they do this sequence recall task with segments and with pitch accents, and they have ceiling performance involved. But in Seoul Korean, because they don't have these suprasegmentals used to express word contrast, they do very good with segments, but they don't do very well with pitch accents. The question is, this difference of perception of pitch accents, would they transfer to the perception of English stress? And the answer is yes. Here we have this dialect of Korean that has pitch accents, and they do very well with both, with segments and with English stress. And here we have Seoul Korean speakers that they don't do as well with stress as they do with segments. And recent research has been testing this now with tone, pitch accents, stress, and many L1, L2 pairs. And now we have enough evidence to say that this Q-way approach can explain this good perception of pitch accents, stress, and tone in an L2 if the L1 has pitch accents, stress, or tone. And now let's see more recent research that was testing the representation approach. For the representation approach, being able to perceive L2 stress or not perceiving it had to do with having a representation. But when we give evidence this way, it seems that having a representation explains it all. And what Ortin and Simonet did was to give these sequence recall tasks to speakers of two head languages, English and Spanish. They both had stress, and they had these representations of stress in the lexicon. And we saw that the Spanish speakers did better than English speakers. So the story of representation is only part of the story, but the transfer of Q and Q ways modulates the perception of this abstract representation. This research was done at the lexical level, and I did with some colleagues also some tests to see if these Q weights could modulate perception of stress at the post-lexical level, at the sentence level. Why? Because when we are seeing words in isolation, for example, in Spanish, hablo and habló, we say things in a way that we put a peak of F0 and H star on the stress syllable, on A and on O. But when we insert the same words in a sentence, we change the alignment. And what the alignment is the L star H. Remember that we talk about that. So here we have something that is ascending, but the peak goes into O. What happens to English speakers is that they have this type of alignment in both, in words and in sentences. So when they insert words in sentences, they don't have to do this post-lexical massage of adjusting cues and cue shapes, into when you say stress in a sentence. So I built some continuum of pitch peak that was moving, in the word mama, mama, and then duration. I was changing the duration of both syllables, and the pitch, the H star was also moving along the word. And I crossed the two continuums, and I put the word in a sentence. And we saw that here English speakers used duration, and they used the peak on the first on the syllable that was stressed. They don't use this post-tonic alignment. However, here Spanish speakers use duration, but not to the same extent that English speakers. And what they use as a cue to perceive stress is this post-tonic alignment. So what we are getting from these studies is that this representation of stress is helping, in your first language, is helping to perceive stress or any other word prominence unit in a second language. But there are many factors modulating this perception. Cue transfer and cue weights is one of these factors, and it happens at the lexical and post-lexical level. All this research, though, about cues doesn't take into consideration a very important difference between tone language and stress language and pitch accent languages, is that stress languages, they don't have, when we say stress, when we stress one syllable, the pitch shape of the stressed syllable changes with the intonation of the sentence. For example, when we are saying Mary, the word Mary has a stress in the first syllable. But depending if we are saying a declarative sentence or a question, we are going to change the pitch shape of the stressed syllable. It's always on the stressed syllable, but the shape changes. Like, for example, Mary versus Mary. So the pitch shape of me changes. In tone, the pitch shape is fixed at the lexical level. And one question that we can answer, that we can address also, is whether having a fixed pitch shape in the lexicon conditions the perception of stress. If you have a tone language as your native language and you perceive stress in the second language, the fact of having a pitch shape fixed in the lexicon influences your perception of the stress in the second language. And for this, also with some students and some colleagues, we did an experiment with Chinese, English speakers, and Spanish speakers. It was a lexical retrieval task, and we had words in English and non-words. I am showing you the results with words. So all groups used the same words, and we saw that the results are very different. And the difference is very nice. You will see it here. Here we have the different conditions, the different pairs. Here we have mismatching segments, a mismatching F0, a mismatching segments, an F0, full match, and a full mismatch. And you see that the circles represent the rising F0, and the triangles here represent a falling F0. We see that for English speakers, pitch shape doesn't have any significant effect. For Spanish learning of English, we find the same pattern. We have here the full match, the mismatch, and here the partial mismatches, but there are no significant differences between pitch shape. When we go to the Chinese speakers of English, we have the same pattern, the full mismatch, the full match, and the partial mismatches here in the middle. But we see for the two conditions where the segments are identical, which is the mismatch on F0 or the full match, the pitch shape has a strong effect. And what it's saying to us is that Chinese speakers of English have a strong preference to represent English stress with falling pitch. And we can interpret these results as if Chinese speakers of English are reinterpreting English stress as a one tone language, which is a falling tone, right? So here we have a summary. All this research says to us that representing word prominence in your native language is a necessary condition, but not sufficient condition to perceive word prominence in a second language. And we see that the perception of word prominence in a second language is modulated by L1 to L2 cue weight transfer at both the lexical and post-lexical levels. And this transfer happens amongst any type of word prominence, stress, pitch accent, and tone. We also see that whether your first language has a fixed shape, a fixed pitch shape in your lexical representations or not, is also going to condition how well you perceive prominence in a second language. And there are other factors that are being tested or need to still to be tested, no? Which, like, for example, we can think of different pitch alignments or duration ratios or frequencies of uses of different pitch accents. And there are many that need to be experimentally addressed. But a reflection, an interim reflection. So recently I did the exercise of revising literature in second language stress and second language rhythm and second language sentence intonation to write a review paper. And I did the exercise of reading how many contexts address, how many studies address context of additive bilingualism and how many addressed context of subtractive bilingualism. And to no surprise, we can see that most of these conclusions know that we need a representation in our L1 of word prominence to be able to hear word prominence in an L2. All this research is based on context of additive bilingualism. And even with this field research on context of subtractive bilingualism, we see that the things that are the contribution of this paper is very valuable because they are finding patterns that we don't find in context of additive bilingualism. Let me give you an example. For example, in Spanish heritage learners of stress, right? This paper is very nice because it tests native speakers of Spanish, English learners of Spanish in a university in an American university where learning Spanish constitutes additive bilingualism, and then heritage Spanish speakers in the US where learning Spanish is kind of a subtractive bilingualism context. And they see that the perception and the production is coherent in the context of additive bilingualism. Native Spanish speakers have equally high perception and production of Spanish stress. English learners of Spanish have equally low perception and production of Spanish stress, but heritage Spanish speakers have high perception and low production. And this is explained because context of subtractive bilingualism don't give opportunities of use, but yes, for perception. These speakers they hear Spanish at home. Their parents, their grandparents speak Spanish at home, but they at home, they speak English. And then in a school, they interact with English. So they can develop perceptual representations, but they cannot develop production representations. And this is why we find this incoherent. And then, so this reflection is important because then we see that if we want to have a complete understanding of the perception of word prominence in a second language, we really need to study all these different contexts of bilingualism. Okay, enough of this reflection. Let's go to rhythm. The definition of rhythm: the sensation of isochrony conveyed by the repetition of visual and auditory patterns. This is a very general definition of rhythm, but here you have something more close. I'm going to play tango and a valse, and you have here the speech wave and the differences in intensity. And here you have different patterns of visual repetition that you can match with the auditory stimuli. Let's see if you see which one is which. Can you hear? And now this one.
I don't know if it's just me, Martha, but I don't think we can hear.
Oh, what a pity.
Yeah.
Oh, what a pity. Anyway, So basically, this is a tango, and if you could hear, I was hoping that you could match the auditory rhythm with the visual image. And this is the valse with a pum, 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 pum repetition. And you could match the repetition in the auditory stimuli with the visual one. What a pity. Anyway, so imagine that you could do that. Okay, oops. Now I'm hearing it. And okay, this is the next slide. So the question is how we represent this rhythm, these repetitions, in a speech. How do we measure it? There are two types of measures. One is the duration-based measures, and the other is the pitch-based measures. Let's start with the duration-based measures. So here we have two languages, and those are consonants and vowels, and those represent the duration of the vowel interval and the duration of the consonant interval. Here you observe long vowels, short vowels, long vowels, short vowels, and here you observe also a lot of variation in the duration of consonants. These ones to represent a stressed time language like English, where you have very long stressed vowels, very short reduced vowels, and you have complex onsets and complex codas, which make long consonant intervals, versus also short consonant intervals, right? B represents syllable time language, where the difference between stressed and unstressed vowels is modest, and it also represents a language that has a more simple consonant structure because, simple syllable structure where there are not many complex onsets and many complex codas. What happens? That the variation of vowel duration and the variation of consonant duration intervals is much reduced, no, in comparison to A. So these variations are the variations of duration of vowel intervals and consonant intervals, and the percentage of vowels, for example, in a sentence, is what we use to measure rhythm. And these measures are very affected by speech rhythm. And we use what is called the bar conormalizations that we apply to the vowel and consonant intervals. The pitch-based measures try to perceive something different. Imagine that this is a head versus an edge language. Imagine that this is an F0 track, and we have lows and highs, another high, low. Here is a language like English, where each sentence has a different melody because we have different pitch accents being attached to stressed syllables. This could be, the repetition is not very obvious, but imagine a language like here, like Tokyo Japanese. This is one part of each sentence has what we call accentual phrases. They have this hat, several words, no, that are produced with this hat pitch shape. And then another words, the next two words with another hat pitch shape. So the sentence has this hat pitch shape, this hat pitch shape, this hat, which makes the perception of a rhythm based on pitch very regular. Now imagine these two head languages. All of them have pitch accents within a sentence, and they are linked to stressed syllables or whatever. But here we have a language that has a low high and another low high and another low high and another low high. So this pitch shape is very frequent, and therefore the sensation of rhythmicity is much higher than in another head language where there are many pitch accents being attached, and they form a melody that is not as regular. This regularity, this repetition of pitch shapes is measured, for example, with the distance in milliseconds from age to age. And here there will be more variation from age to age. So this is more regular, this is not as regular. And the same, the distance from the low to low. This one would be very regular. There is no variation from these distances. This one will be less regular. Also, we measure pitch excursions. If there is a pitch range that is very high, another is very contracted, there is compression. And we see that Suna Yun is proposing some measurements of macro rhythm, which refers to the speech-based measures, and is the standard deviation of the peak-to-peak distances, the standard deviation of the low-to-low distances, and the standard deviation of the pitch excursions, right? And they propose like a measure that captures this rhythmicity based on these pitch measures. One thing to consider is that these pitch measures are capturing rhythmicity at two different levels of our hierarchical, our prosodic domains. The duration-based measures will appreciate repetition below the word level. We have vowel consonants, vowel intervals, and consonant intervals. And these pitch measures appreciate repetition of pitch at the word level or higher. And this is why we will call them macro rhythm, will be pitch-based measures, and micro rhythm will be duration-based measures. When we revise the literature on L2 rhythm, we see that all the literature is based on micro rhythm measures. There is the debate of whether these measures are appropriate to capture rhythm. This debate is very interesting, and one of the persons that is leading this debate is Arvaniti. So it's worth reading their concerns. But there is also a group of people that are working on refining these measures to be able to obtain consistent results. And in fact, there are some consistent results. But again, when we look at which context of language contact the data was extracted from, we see that we have an additive bilingualism. What are these consistent results? L2 rhythm is learnable, and there is a lot of L1 to L2 transfer. And learning is modulated by L2 proficiency and by the similarity between L1 and L2. When we revise subtractive context, we see a pattern that is different, is that the frequency of L2 to L1 transfer, it happens more often in a context of subtractive bilingualism. So again, something to keep in mind. When we are examining L2 rhythm that uses macro rhythm, we see that there is no literature yet. What we have are L1 cross-linguistic studies. So these measurements of macro rhythm are very new, and researchers are trying to see if they are sensitive enough to capture cross-linguistic differences. And we have very few studies, maybe 3, 4, 5. I just mentioned 2. They are recent. And these few studies are successful in capturing differences between Spanish and English and Italian. And they also propose some adjustments. And I would recommend to read these papers and read these adjustments, saying like the differences between high to high or low to low, these differences in duration, capture macro rhythm, but if we add the differences in pitch excursion, is not working, because pitch excursion and regularity between highs or lows are capturing two different sensations of, one is capturing rhythmicity and the other not. And there is a good discussion on that. So my contribution here is a paper that I did with my colleague Yun Nagao from Japan, that we are studying these micro and macro rhythm measures in Japanese learners of English. Yun is a university professor in Japan, and he organizes this English recitation contest. I'm going to show you a video of the contest so you can appreciate how it works. And basically, students have to imitate 2-minute TED Talks. So we have the original English TED Talk. We have the Japanese, the student rendition of the English TED Talk. They imitate, with emotion, with prosody. They put a lot of emphasis on this part of the imitation. And we have the student translation of the English TED Talk into Japanese. So for you to have an idea. So this is you. I don't know if you could hear. Could you hear that one?
No, we couldn't.
Oh, well, in this video, you had my colleague Yun introducing the students, and there is a big auditorium, and you see these students really, with gestures moving up and down the scenario, and really they are trying to imitate emotion and prosody. And what this study is interesting because this comparison between Japanese and English gives you the chance to compare micro and macro rhythm, because Japanese has a weak macro rhythm. It doesn't have a stress, it has pitch accents, but words can be pitch accented or not. So not every word has a pitch accent. However, in English, all words have primary stress. So there is a strong micro rhythm. All content words have primary stress. So there is a strong macro rhythm. But in macro rhythm, when we go at the above the word level, we see that for Japanese is a strong. They repeat this hat, shape, pitch, very many times in every sentence. But in English, no, every sentence has a different intonation. And what we did, we took 2 students and we did in-depth analysis. These 2 students were given different, the group of judges gave them like different scores. The student 1 was given a very high score by this amount of judges, and student 2 no. But when we look at the microrhythm measurements, we see that it seems that the student 2 is fantastic. So here we have Barkovy and vowel percentage, and here we have the Japanese L1 sample, the English L1 sample. They fall in the places that are expected. And here we see the first English imitation of this student and the second English imitation. Is quite close, is learning, especially is learning about variation of vowel duration, right? Here we have Japanese L1, English L1, and here we have student 2, and it seems that the first and the second renditions are fantastic, and we have these measurements, that is vowel percentage and Barkovy, these microrhythm measurements. We have other microrhythm measurements, and we have the same performance. The student 1 does very well, but the student 2 seems fantastic. And the judges give a better score to student 1. So we want to see why there is this inconsistency between the microrhythm and the perception of these judges. So what we did is to unfold this vowel variation into the things that this variation was cueing. So some vowel variation cues content words versus function words. We see that content words have stressed syllable and function words has only reduced syllables, and if we do a ratio, we need to see a difference. Here we have student 1, student 2. The English TED Talk, first imitation, second imitation. Both students are on target. They can reproduce vowel variation for content versus function words. The same with IP lengthening. IP lengthening is the end of an intonational phrase gets elongated. This happens in Japanese too, so they are only transferring, and we see that they are very much on target. But here we see the difference in vowel duration to cue stressed versus unstressed vowels. We see here that subject 1 does it, but subject 2 doesn't. For subject 2, stressed vowels and unstressed vowels have a very similar duration. What happens with macrorhythm? With macrorhythm, we measure the tone to tone, meaning any difference between highs and consecutive highs and lows. Here, differences between high to high and low to low. We see that here the Japanese speakers have to learn. They start with Japanese very regular macro rhythm, and they have to learn English irregular macro rhythm. We see that subject 1 is much on target. he does an irregular macro rhythm, but subject to no. So these results, what we think is that, well, we see that macro rhythm results are coherent with perception, that subject 1 seems to be better than subject 2. Micro rhythm are coherent with these perception results only when we take into consideration different phonological contrast. For example, stress. When we see that there is this lack of cueing of the stress with duration, then it's coherent with this perceptual score. So here we are starting a new hypothesis that possibly Japanese speakers of English need to learn stress first to increase the microrhythm regularity, and then they can increase the macrorhythm irregularity. It will appear as a consequence, as a result of learning stress. And so instead of studying rhythm just with macro rhythm or just with macro rhythm, we need to study the interaction of both, because in different L1 and L2 language pairs, they will relate differently. And another thing that is important is that there are individual differences. We see that stress was learnable with this exercise of repetition and imitation by subject 1, but not by subject 2. General conclusions. So we see that adults are capable of learning both L2 stress and L2 rhythm. But we see that the stage of the research in these two areas is very different. We see that we have a lot of research in L2 word prosody. We have a model of representation that explains, able to perceive or not word prominence in an L2, and that this perception is being modulated by different cues. And but when we see L2 rhythm, we see that there is research on L2 rhythm only based on duration measures, but not at all on macro rhythm measures. We still have no model of L2 perception of rhythm, and we are still learning how to measure rhythm. We need to use these macro rhythm measures. So also we observe that there is a strong bias towards context of additive bilingualism, and we also observed that with the few research that we have in context of subtractive bilingualism, we are finding patterns that didn't appear in context of additive bilingualism. In stress, we have these non-coherent perception and production patterns by heritage speakers of the Spanish in relation to Spanish stress perception. And with rhythm, we see that in context of subtractive bilingualism, there is a heavy L2 to L1 Q transfer. And in context of additive bilingualism, we saw a different direction of transfer. So with all these things, what can we do for future research? First, that when we are studying L2 stress, basically we have a model that works and we can add detail to that model. But when we are studying L2 rhythm, we are in an adventure. We are exploring, everything is new. We are still learning how to measure rhythm. So we are at different stages, and probably the research questions and the research being designed will have different goals. But regardless of the area of L2 prosody we are studying, we see that something that repeats is that we have a strong bias studying context of additive bilingualism. And we need to put remedy to that. The first thing is to study more context of subtractive bilingualism. Then we also need to observe our gaze, our way of interpreting bilingualism, because the way that we understand bilingualism will have an impact on the way we design experiments. And when we add this context of subtractive bilingualism, there are many other things that we need to be able to measure, like prestige to languages, individual psychoaffective factors that we didn't take into consideration when we were studying only additive context of bilingualism. And to finalize, Usually when we study prosody, we put an emphasis on the form of prosody, but not to the meaning. And we saw at the beginning what one of the challenges of studying prosody is that the same form expresses many meanings. There is a lot of ambiguity. And this is especially noticeable when we study rhythm and alter rhythm. See, we have all these syllable time, stress time, these duration measures or pitch-based measures, but we are not saying what is the function or what is the meaning of this rhythm. Are we talking about different speech styles? Are we reflecting emotion? So what's the meaning? What's the function linked to these forms? We need to pay more attention to that. And with that, I will conclude the presentation.
Thank you very much. This was a very, very interesting presentation, very clear, and it shows so many exciting research that are being conducted in this field. And it seems that there are lots of things to do. And I was wondering whether you know any research in the area that is being made with online techniques like eye tracking or EEG.
Yes. There are many of these techniques are more amenable to do studies on word prosody, right? Especially, but when we need to go beyond word prosody and start studying, for example, at sentence level and studying at the dialogue level and still have some control. So that is the new challenge, right?
Yeah.
That's the new challenge.
And I think that I don't know, I'm not very familiar with this specific area of research, but I was also wondering whether there is any study that was made with filtered speech, like with no segmental information at all.
Especially on rhythm, there is a lot of research on that because I made a selection of things to explain because we have to select due to time constraints. But at the beginning of these duration measures of rhythm come from research from Ramu, Meller, that they were doing research with infants, and they wanted to they showed that babies, infants, even newborns could distinguish their mother tongue from languages that belong to other rhythm classes. And to test that, they got rid of the segmental differences. So what they did, they had sets of sentences in different languages, and there are different ways of getting rid of this segmental information. One was to replace all consonants by S and all vowels by A. So they had this sa, sa, sa. And the only thing they were paying attention to were to these duration differences between vowels and consonants without paying attention to different inventories of consonants. And they preserve also pitch variation on each segment. So that, yeah, all this research. And it's very useful when you want to separate, for example, rhythm and suprasegmentals from the effect of segmental data. All these filtered and all these ways of neutralizing the effects of segments when you want to address suprasegmentals.
It's very interesting, Mark. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions from the audience?
Maria, do we have someone asking any questions in the chat there in our YouTube channel?
Thank you to you.
For me, it's a lot of food for thought. The macro rhythm thing, I really liked it. So I'll explore that later. So thank you for giving me that. Okay, some people couldn't watch the whole presentation, Marta, but they will watch later. I think Marta is also available to answer questions via email, right, Marta?
Yes, absolutely. So if you want to watch later or something comes to you later on, yes, I can answer any email.
Okay, Amanda, do you want to say something or should we?
Yeah, I think, well, I just have to thank you both, Marta and Miguel, for accepting my invitation and making part in this event. So it has been super successful from the point of view that the talks have been amazing and we're all interacting a lot and having the opportunity of knowing more of each other's works, right? So I consider that very successful and you're all part of it. I thank you very much.
Thank you for the chance of this talk and meeting you all. And thank you, Miguel, as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Your kind introduction and questions. Yes.
Okay. So if that's it for today, I thank you all once again, and we can have a little bit of rest.
Yes, it was an intense day, right?
Yeah, tomorrow we have it's a pity that Marcos Maia won't be able to give the first talk of the day, right? He is still in the hospital, unfortunately, but he's recovering well. Don't know, something like. And also, Wilson Lima just told me that he also had some health issues, that some kind of virus he caught. He also won't be able to give the workshop tomorrow, so we'll count only on Natasha Warner and her colleague from the Tamen Nation, right? On the tomorrow. Well, I planned the conference so that we would have thematic days, right? Like the first day will be more general. Today will be the focus on the psycholinguistics of multilingual speech, right? More related to speech today. Tomorrow is supposed to be related to the psycholinguistics of indigenous languages. But yeah, now we have it only half day. Some of the presentations, the oral presentations, and the last talk by Natasha Warner due to those cancellations. So it's beyond my anything I can do then, right? And the last day is concerning psycholinguistics of multilingual translation. So we'll have Robert, we'll have Natalia, and Pamela also speaking, right? Nobody canceled yet, so I assume the last day will be complete. But tomorrow, unfortunately, we won't have Marcos and Wilson. But I'll send you all a message as well to tell you that also via email. Okay, that's okay then. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.